Hey guys, welcome back to the Pauper metagame. This is your host, MSP. I just want to take a second to say that so many people are so wrong about Pauper in paper right now that it is just crazy. There's a ton of ignorance, there's a ton of people saying a lot of things that they don't really have any basis to say because they just don't know what they're talking about. So before I get started, let me just give you a little quick background. I've been playing Pauper since, I don't know, like 2009, 2010, playing in the online Pauper events off and on. I've played pretty much all the decks. I haven't been playing the competitive challenges as much lately, but I don't know. Back in the earlier years, I did quite a bit. But I've always kept my finger on the pulse of the game. I've been around for every single step in the game's process, going from the weekend challenge to daily events, now to leagues, and then now there's a weekend challenge again. And we still have leagues, so that's pretty good. Anyway, I just want to take on some of the comments that people have been making about Pauper and put that in a more appropriate context for some of the criticisms that have been coming in as Pauper is starting to take off and get a little bit of traction in the paper world. I suppose I should also mention that before Channel Fireball announced that they were going to be doing Grand Prix side events with the Pauper format, I was actually already in the process of working on building a lot of Pauper paper decks. I've got about 31 or 32 Pauper decks. About 2/3 of those are finished, and the others are only missing like 3 or 4 cards here and there that I just need to get around to taking care of and trading or buying or whatever. But the point is, I could care less whether paper Pauper lasts or whatever. I'm going to actually keep all my Pauper cards. I'm not buying them just hoping they'll go up in value. A lot of the Pauper cards I have purchased did go up in value, but I don't care. It wasn't a financial decision to try to invest. I'm just putting together sweet decks that I can enjoy playing forever. I'll have an entire set of over 30 decks that I can take with me and play with a friend because while drafting cube and stuff like that is fun, it's also fun to have access to a full constructed metagame that a couple of friends can pull out any type of deck they want to play and sit down and play it, and to be able to put that together at the fraction of what it would cost to put something like that together in any other format is pretty sweet. So that's where my interest comes in as far as paper Pauper. I don't really intend to attend any major events, but I've picked up my fair share of paper Pauper cards. Anyway, let's jump right in. I've just written down some criticisms here, some random ones I've heard from different talking heads in the online Magic World, podcasters, YouTubers, and whatnot. Here are some random criticisms I've heard that more advanced players like pros will get involved. If Pauper ever had a Grand Prix or a big event, then some pros would show up and solve the format and break the format and all this. This is a bunch of nonsense. I'll explain this in a little bit. Next, number 2, the format is a fad, and this hype will be over by April. And anybody that thinks that this is going to all just completely blow over by April is just so off their rocker, but I've heard a few people say stuff like this. Number 3, when prices for Pauper cards get more expensive, the format will die. This is also idiocy. Here's the thing. These are incremental buying decisions. So Pauper decks, a lot of people, well, you know what? I'm not going to, let me get to the end of the list and I'll come back and explain everything, but this is also wrong. Number 4, you cannot safely invest in the cards because everything can get reprinted. I'll address that as well. Number 5, there's no depth to the gameplay. Number 6, people are only playing Pauper because standard is bad. Number 7, the prices have already gone crazy on Pauper. So there, some people are saying that's problematic. Number 8, what happens when somebody goes and buys all the commons in the old sets, or what happens when somebody buys out something, or the typical speculators start paying attention, get involved. It's going to ruin the format. It's going to be Armageddon for Pauper, that kind of thing. So let's work through all these. Let's start with number 1. More advanced players in larger tournaments will break the format. The people who say this stuff don't really have any idea how Pauper works. They don't understand the metagame. They don't understand the format. If they've ever played, it's surface level. This isn't a quote-unquote solvable format, because you're dealing with a lot of decks that all have different strengths and weaknesses, and it's very metagame dependent. The sideboard cards you choose are very important. You know, if you know that a whole lot of Tron decks are going to show up versus a lot of affinity decks versus a lot of elf decks versus a heavy field of burn, I mean, there are so many different types of decks that can evolve and shuffle their way into a tournament that you've got to be ready for. So, you know, there's a lot of adjustments that can be made in the sideboard alone. And it's just not, you know, this is a format that's been tweaked, that's been played with, that's been messed around with, you know, for over 10 years just in the online metagame alone. This metagame has been advancing a long way. It is what it is. I'm not saying that pros won't do well at it. In fact, I think a lot of pros, once they get familiar with Pauper, are actually going to really love it. Because I think a lot of pros want to get into games where a lot of little decisions are going to be made, where playing a really tight game and making really good decisions can help you win. And I think that most pros tend to dislike the windmill slam super powerful draw that just lets your opponent win the game because it's such an incredibly powerful card. There's not as much of that in the Pauper format, and I think that it's actually a format that a lot of pros will really like. But it's not a format that lends itself to being quote-unquote solved, at least not in any permanent sense. You can't build one deck that's going to just be the best deck forever. It just won't work. You can't even shuffle back and forth between two decks. There's just too much going on in the format. Now, having said that, because the field is so diverse, it's a lot like Modern or Legacy, where if you have mastery over a particular deck and you know all the matchups really well, then you can just take the same deck and do reasonably well with it. But again, these people that talk about, you know, the metagame just being worked out by pros and it'll never get off the runway, they do not know what they are talking about. In fact, when you listen to some of the pros talk now, when they get ready for pro tours, instead of trying to, you know, figure out, you know, how to beat Standard, for example, a lot of them will go online and look at the online data, you know, probably from MTG Goldfish, and just start working from there. Instead of trying to outsmart the players that are playing online, they look at the data that's coming in and looking at those results and maybe tweak some things. But, you know, it's just one of those things that eventually people will figure out that the format has been around for so long. There's been a ton of competitive play that it's not just some little simple format that you can bring a pro in, he'll build the best deck, and it's going to ruin everything. It just doesn't work like that. Number 2, the format is a fad. This hype will be over by April. The thing is, again, this format has been around online for years and years and years. And the crazy thing about it is the Pauper League, you know, tends to be more popular than the Legacy League. And, you know, it's not quite as popular as Modern or Standard, but it's funny to think about how many people are playing Modern and Standard online just to practice so that they can go play in events with their paper decks. It's not that people really want to be playing Modern and Standard online so much as it's necessary to practice. But the people that are playing Pauper online, well, up until recently, there's never been any real paper events you could go play in. So those people were just playing the format online because that was the format they wanted to play, or that was the format they could afford to play. But no one was playing Pauper online, you know, just to practice for tournaments in real life. And that just goes to show how popular the format is, that it's still, you know, has, you know, pretty good numbers, actually. I want to say it's like, I don't know, maybe a half to 2/3 the population of what you'll find in Modern or Standard. at any given time in the leagues, something like that. Anyway, number 3, when prices for Pauper cards get more expensive, the format will die. This is silly. The prices for Pauper cards getting more expensive is going to be a reflection of two possible things. Either people buying Pauper cards because they want to play the format, or number 2, speculators buying up cards because they, are either correctly or incorrectly believing that certain cards are underpriced compared to where they should be or soon will be. And there's this sense that, a lot of speculators are going to swoop in and, drive up prices and scare everybody off or whatever. This is all just a bunch of nonsense. A lot of people don't realize that the paper Pauper decks, even before all this hype, most of them were $40 or $50 already. There were not just a lot of $10, $20 decks out there. There were some, and you could find them and build them. I mean, maybe, your tier 3, tier 2 stuff. But all the top tier stuff was, all $50, $60, $70, maybe even $80. And you're seeing the prices on some of these decks going up a little bit, maybe 20 or 30%. But I mean, a deck going from, $50 up to $80, I don't even know if any of the decks have spiked that much. It's probably more like from 50 to 70, maybe something like that. This is, it's kind of a lot, but it's really not. I mean, considering that, there's only so many commons that actually have room to go up. What a lot of people don't realize is that there are very few Pauper commons that actually have room to go infinitely crazy. You can't corner the market. You can't just go in and buy up a whole bunch of, any particular card, because, a lot of times you're going to get stuck holding the bag because we're talking about commons. And even the older sets, the print runs are large enough that, unless we're talking about Alpha, Beta, Arabian Nights, Legends, Antiquities, that kind of stuff, I mean, there's just too many commons. You can't corner the market unless there's a real genuine demand. The prices are not gonna stay up there. So anyway, it's silly. There are some cards that are going up, and yeah, there's probably some speculators jumping in and picking up some things and maybe driving prices up by a few dollars here and there. And there's a few cards that have gone from 50 cents to $4, but just a few. The majority of commons can't and never will go anywhere. I'm just going to give you an example here real quick. When you look at the Elves deck right now, which is very popular, looking at it in paper, Birchlore Rangers, there's way too many of these to ever be more than maybe $1. I doubt that. Probably 50 cents. I mean, these are never going to be that much. Magic 2015 was printed into the ground. Elvish Mystic is never getting out of Pennyland. Essence Warden, that's a set. Planar Chaos. This is a card that, has a little bit of room to be worth something. It's like $1 right now. It could maybe go to $2, but this is a card that also occasionally shows up in Modern, I believe. I'd have to, let's see here. Let's pull this up and see if this card is showing up. Okay, I'm not actually seeing it in any Modern decks, but I'm sure this is a card that sees some kind of, fringe, casual play or EDH play. It's not just, $1 because of Pauper. And I think another thing you can actually look at with this card, when you look at the paper price, it hasn't gone anywhere or done anything in months and months and months and months. Since Pauper's come out, it's not like every common card is just going crazy. It was about $1, $1.10 to $1.20 before Pauper started being played in paper, and it's still basically the same price. Finhorn Elves, this card has been printed way too much to ever get, super crazy pricey. Ice Age was a very large print run, even though it's an old set. There is a lot of Ice Age out there. In addition to that, it's been reprinted in a few other things. It was reprinted in FDV 20 and Deckmasters. So it's got there's a few other copies out there too. But again, this is a card. It looks like it's kind of trailed up a little bit, but it's been really slow. You got to go back 2 years basically. In 2 years, it's gone up 50 cents. If you just kind of look from the time in which we got this announcement, it's maybe gone up like 5 or 10 cents since, we got paper events. Nettle Sentinel is a card that, okay, this one I know does see play in Modern. So yeah, it sees play in Legacy and Modern, so it's a card that was already worth something even before things started to take off and get crazy. And if you look at the paper card, yeah, I mean its price has gone up, from $2 to $4 on the news of paper Pauper becoming a thing. But it went from 70 cents up to basically $4. Back in 2015, just with other things shaking around in Modern and whatnot. So I mean, you can't get there with most commons just off of Pauper alone. And a lot of these cards that are pricier, like Nettle Sentinel, you could buy these at $4, and even if Pauper completely crashed and burned, you're not going to lose your money and everything. Maybe it'll go down to $3, but this is a card that has staying power, and it can't get crazy expensive because eventually it'll just get reprinted. So, Quarian Ranger, that's another. This is an older card. This is one of those few cards that's so old that people, could see the price on this. This is a card that could maybe get up to $5, $6, $7, $8 eventually, if it never got reprinted. But as soon as this card becomes worth $4 or $5, Wizards is going to throw it in a Masters set. And then Elvish Vanguard, Elvish Visionary, Liliana Huntmaster, Llanowar Elves, all this kind of stuff. Lead the Stampede. There's just way too many copies of these cards floating around to ever really be worth much. And even when you look at the actual paper price for Elves, and you actually look at the cards, the pricey cards are Nettle Sentinel and Quarian Ranger and Priest of Titania and Gleeful Sabotage. I guess Tangle. So, I mean, and we're not talking about anything over $10 except for Quarian Ranger and Nettle Sentinel, which are cards that are really popular to casual players and see play in other formats. So, people are just freaking out. Like a lot of commons, it doesn't matter how popular Pauper gets. These decks can only get so expensive because most of the commons just don't have room to get that expensive. And when you look at any other format and you actually look at the price of the decks, there's just no comparison whatsoever in terms of prices. I mean, you look at a random Modern deck and you got like a couple of cards that are $20 each. I mean, you got a playset of Karn for $150. I don't think we're going to see any more than one or two Pauper decks ever. At least not over the next year or two, unless things got really crazy, be worth more than $150. But even if they were, again, you're looking at just a playset of one card in a Modern deck that's going to run you that. So anyway, even if Pauper decks do get up to, a couple $100, which it's going to take a while for anything like that to happen, and frankly, I doubt it. I think maybe you could see some Pauper decks get in the 100 to 150 range, but just very few. But even if they did, it's an eternal format. You buy your deck, and you're going to be able to play it for a long time because the meta moves very slowly. You go and you take a look at the Modern decks out there: $1,000, $700, $600, $600, $1,000, $1,000. I mean, there's just no comparison. Even if Pauper, quote unquote, gets expensive, it's going to be dirt cheap compared to playing Vintage, Modern, or Legacy. So anyway, you cannot safely invest in the cards because everything can get reprinted. Well, I mean, it's funny because you'll hear people that'll say that you can't safely, buy Pauper cards because they're going to get reprinted. But then those exact same people will say that, oh, Pauper commons are going to get so expensive nobody's going to be able to play. I mean, well, which is it? It can't really be both. It can't be that we're just going to have all of our commons reduced to being worth nothing because of reprints, while at the same time the format's going to get so expensive that nobody can play. I mean, the truth is it's a little bit of both, right? I mean, yeah, some commons will get reprinted and it'll be made cheap, and other commons it may take a while before they get their reprints, and they might get a little pricey. But we're just talking about a small handful of cards. The other thing is, when was the last time you, you heard one of these Pauper critics stop and be intellectually honest and mention the fact that every single card in Modern, every single card in Standard can be reprinted? And what would you rather be holding? Would you rather be holding a $5 or $6 quote unquote expensive common card that gets reprinted and goes down to being worth $1? So, whoa, you just lost like $4 or $5. Oh, the devastation. Or would you rather be holding a modern card worth $50 or $60 that gets reprinted and goes down to $40? You lose $10 or $20, maybe even more. If these modern sets keep getting, everybody's been thinking about these modern sets, with the past in mind, where these were limited print runs. Well, Iconic Masters just took the gloves off. When you take a master set and you ship it to Walmart and you mass print it, people are like, well, with modern sets, Wizards does it responsibly. They print some cards, but they do a limited print run, and then, prices bounce back. Well, the damage that Iconic Masters is going to do to some of these card prices, it's going to take years, if ever, for some of these cards to come back to their old price levels. It's not like, Modern Masters 2017, which was responsibly done. Anyway, the point is, with Pauper, even, when a card gets reprinted, you're talking about losing a few bucks. Whereas if you're holding a modern deck, holy crap, you could literally lose $100 when you wake up the next day and realize that, the next modern set just reprinted a couple of your staples from your modern deck. So I think you can sleep a whole lot better at night with a Pauper deck than with a modern deck. And when your standard deck rotates, if something happens and you either, forget, or you just don't have time to, carefully manage your standard collection and make sure that you get everything taken care of before rotation, and your cards rotate before you trade them or sell them, well, you're guaranteed to lose money. If you've got $1,000 standard collection, when it rotates, you're looking at losing at least, probably $100 or $200. Whereas if you're sitting on a $200 Pauper collection and a reprint comes out, no man, maybe you lose $20. Like maybe. It's like you can't even compare these two things. But people are ridiculous. The next thing you'll hear people say is there's no depth to the gameplay. I mean, if as someone who's actually, played a little bit of Modern, played a little bit of Standard, I've played block format. I mean, I've played most things, and Pauper has a very unique feel to it, but there's a lot of depth to the gameplay. The kind of people who enjoy drafting, who enjoy that kind of gameplay where, making good, sound, technical decisions actually matters a lot more. And, at the same time, Pauper's also a format where really analyzing the meta, calling the meta correctly also matters. There's a lot of these elements of advanced gameplay that exist in Pauper, and you do get to use some fairly powerful cards in Modern, and there's a lot of little tiny interactions and a lot of little strategies and understandings of the game, and there's a lot more depth than I think people would think at first glance. So I don't know, you have to kind of get a taste for it, but I think most people that actually play Pauper end up walking away going, wow, this is a sweet format. And, to quote LSV, the great Louis Scott Vargas, Hall of Famer, one of the, most amazing Magic pros of all time, he's said Pauper is a sweet format. And I know he wasn't just giving it lip service. Back in the day, I remember seeing him playing in some of those Pauper tournaments online, and he genuinely enjoys the format. I say if it's good enough for LSV where he's not getting bored with it, I think it's probably good enough for anybody. Next, people are only playing because, Standard's bad. Well, the problem with that is Pauper has been around, again, for like a decade. This is not a flash in the pan thing. This is not Tiny Leaders. This is not Frontier. This wasn't just invented yesterday. What happened was Pauper's been around with a steady following for years. It should have gone paper a long time ago, but it's never gotten the real support it needs. The game needs to be acknowledged as a quote-unquote real format. Basically, it's a format that you need to be able to get Planeswalker points for playing, that you can have a sanctioned event, and WotC will actually acknowledge the tournament. Once that happens, Pauper's gonna do just fine, because Magic is a cyclical game where people are gonna come and go. But if you've got $1,000 legacy deck, well, you can't really have a legacy deck for $1,000 these days. But if you got $1,000 modern deck and you decide to quit playing Magic and you're not going to play for a few years, you probably are going to sell that deck. But if you've got a $100 Pauper deck, you might just hold on to it, and then you're more likely to come back later. Also, brand new players will have a place that they can get into the game that's a lot more accessible. And these are the kind of things that are just good for Magic as a whole. Imagine somebody who wants to get into Magic and play the game, but they literally cannot afford to play Magic, in Standard or Modern or Legacy or any of those formats. Someone who can't even afford to draft, they can't afford to pay $15 every weekend. Maybe they've only got $20 a month, so they could either draft one weekend every month, and that's all the Magic they get to play, or they could spend 3 or 4 months slowly accumulating a deck that will last them for years. And then after they have their deck that they've accumulated over a few months and they're playing, they can they can be in the game and trade and maybe get a few breaks, play in a few tournaments, and next thing you know, they got some prizes and they're building another deck, and then they're doing well, and the whole rags to riches story, which is awesome. Who doesn't love that? Next thing you know, someone who never even would have been playing Magic is doing well enough playing Magic that they can actually afford to get some cards and trade their way into Standard with some of the prizes they've won and whatnot. So I mean, that's the kind of potential that Pauper has. It's just never really been given much of a chance, and frankly, Channel Fireball and the Professor and different people are kind of giving it a chance. And yeah, I mean, truthfully, Channel Fireball probably has their own motives for why they're doing this. Yeah, they're going to make a boatload of money off of selling a bunch of junk that they have zero cost basis in, admittedly. But you know what? Hey, if all the better. Hey, the more people that benefit. If Channel Fireball wins for, in my opinion, doing the right thing, great. I mean, Magic is a very difficult and expensive game, and frankly, there needs to be a better gateway product. And Pauper is perfect. Because most people who get in playing Pauper are going to advance to other formats. That's fine. But just having it there is going to do a lot of good for the game. And I'm frankly amazed that Wizards hasn't realized this sooner, that more people in the community haven't realized sooner, that Magic needs something that's a eternal, cheaper gateway entry format. So, anyway, the prices have already gone crazy. It's already becoming an inaccessible format. Yeah, this is a bunch of nonsense, complete hooey. You've got one deck that's $122. Oh man, is it Delver? $122. That's just so expensive. How will we? Oh, wait a minute. I'm looking at these modern decks. Let's see, 311. Or I'm sorry, not even modern. I'm sorry, just standard, because modern's too expensive. Let's look at a cheap format. Standard, $300, $200, $200, $250. Gosh, I wonder if I could find a $120 deck. $285, $350, $270. Oh, and did I mention that these standard decks are really only good for like a year and a half, and then you're at least part of your deck's probably going to rotate. 220, 377, 214. What in the world? I remember that there's been like a white blue really cheap budget deck that popped up on the radar. Oh, here we go. I don't know if this is it. I don't know if this is it or not. This is like $75 right here. This is $75, and I don't know. This really isn't the thing I was looking for, but I don't know. At least if you go deep enough, you can find a deck that looks like it won something one time, but for like 80 or 120. But yeah, you got to dig pretty deep. Whereas when you look at the Pauper metagame, the single most expensive deck in Paper right now is $120. So, I mean, I would say, you're still looking at a format where there's a lot of decks that are accessible at, between 40 to 80 bucks. And the top couple of decks right now are 60, 44, 66, 52. I mean, for the top 4 decks, that's pretty amazing considering, again, these are eternal. This is an eternal format, very slowly adjusting. So if you, instead of participating in like 4 drafts, you build one of these decks instead, you're going to have a deck that you can play basically for years. Most likely. I mean, something weird could happen and the metagame could shift. But it's fairly solid investment. So alright. Last, what happens when someone goes and buys up all the commons and all the old sets? Alright. Well, they'll go broke. That's what'll happen. Because anyone that actually knows the Pauper format knows that there's really only a select handful of old commons that are really good in Pauper. There's, a lot of commons out there spread throughout Magic's history. And if you go and buy all of Apocalypse, or you buy up Urza's Saga, or you buy up Mercadian Masks, those given sets might have a couple of commons that are relevant to the Pauper format. That's it, just a couple. Honestly, if you were going to try to isolate a single set that had more actual Pauper staples in it, it's probably more likely to be, something like Zendikar or Worldwake or, one of these later on sets, because frankly, the power level of Magic cards has been going up, and even though, commons aren't, that powerful compared to rares and mythics, even the commons have gotten a lot more powerful in recent years. And so you see a lot more power level on a lot of different commons that are actually printed later in Magic's life. And those cards are out there in such numerous numbers that you could go out and buy 1,000 of them, and it's barely going to move the meter. It's not like, I don't know, Modern, where a card could get low on supply, and you could maybe have a shot at, buying 1,000 copies of a Mythic and doing something as far as shifting the market, until the next, Master set comes along and reprints it. But you just can't really do that in Pauper, not effectively. I mean, maybe you could corner the market on some old foils. That's definitely doable. But who cares? I mean, that if someone wants to, get a bunch of foils and make it expensive for people to pimp out their decks, okay, whatever. The regular players are still going to be able to build their decks for cheap. So, hey, that's the best of both worlds. So, anyway, there's so many criticisms and commentaries from people who are just completely ignorant to how this whole thing works. Also, I've heard people blaming cards for going up in price, where you can't just, they've been blaming Pauper for cards going up, where it's not just Pauper, like Relic of Progenitus, for example, is a card that's played in Pauper, but it's also played in Modern, and that's why its price is getting to where it's at right now. And I've even seen some people look at some uncommons and blame Pauper when those cards aren't even legal in Pauper. So there's just a lot of disinformation out there. Here's the bottom line. Pauper is an amazing format. It is absolutely fantastic and fun to play, especially if you're doing it, casually. And this is a meta that's been tuned and over the course of time. It is a little bit complicated using the online legality instead of using some kind of a new paper format with a new banned and restricted list or something. But the thing about using the online legalities and whatnot is the online metagame has been fine-tuned, ban list adjustments. All of these things have been going on for years, so it's a very good meta. And frankly, if you pick up a handful of these decks and you get a friend who picks up a handful of them, you can have fun just playing casually for hours and hours and hours, and just have a great time. And do it relatively cheap. I mean, instead of buying, a couple of Challenger decks or dual decks or whatever they're calling them these days, pick up a couple of Pauper decks. You can go to MTG Goldfish, pull up the meta, look at all the different decks, find find a couple of them that look interesting that you think might be fun to play against each other, and you could probably actually, contrary to popular belief, even though the price tag on these decks might say 40, 50, 60 bucks, a lot of these cards you can probably get for free, just talking to your friends or digging through bulk. And if you actually have to just buy every single card, again, for $100 or 120 bucks, you can probably get 2 decks. So anyway, that's all I got for today. I just want to kind of rant a little bit and talk about basically how stupid people are, and just kind of shooting off the cuff about Pauper and how it's a fad. And I know there's a lot of people out there who know that Pauper actually is here to stay. It's going to have its ebbs and flows. A lot of it's going to depend on WotC. If WotC will not recognize it as a legitimate format, then yeah, at some point that's going to kill the format. But Pauper has the numbers, it has the appeal to actually get off the runway if Wizards will just let it. And if Wizards does, they'll be the ones that benefit, because it's going to be an excellent gateway format for years to come if they just give it a chance. Anyway, that's all for today, guys. Y'all have a great day.